Imagine a professional criminal who became one of Britain's most valuable spies, a safecracker deemed so dangerous by police that his photograph hung in just about every station across the United Kingdom. This man, who some said couldn't even pick a lock, somehow became Hitler's most trusted British agent and the only British national ever awarded the Iron Cross by the Nazi regime. He was a man who twice parachuted into Britain during World War II carrying German explosives, yet he returned to London as a hero rather than a traitor. How did this charming rogue with a string of broken hearts and empty safes behind him become one of the most important double agents of World War II? This is the true story of Eddie Chapman, criminal, lover, spy and double agent, whose remarkable life zigged and zagged between the shadows of heroism and villainy. Edward Arnold Chapman was born on the 16th of November 1914 in the small village of Burnopfield in northeast England, 4 months into the First World War. As the eldest of 3 children, Eddie grew up in poverty, with a father who was frequently absent as a marine engineer and later spent more time drinking the profits of his rundown pub than being with his family. Despite showing intelligence, Eddie was described by teachers as lazy, insolent, and easily bored. He skipped classes frequently, collecting discarded lemonade bottles from the beach to sell to earn money for afternoons at the cinema. At 17, Eddie Chapman joined the 2nd Battalion of the prestigious Coldstream Guards, lying about his age and forging his father's signature. His military career proved brief. He passed basic training and was even assigned, somewhat ironically in hindsight, to guard the crown jewels. But by the end of 1933, Chapman was discharged from further service. His brother Winston claimed Eddie had disgraced the king's colours by getting a girl pregnant and had broken out of the military detention barracks. Not only had his military career come to an end prematurely, but the death of his mother in 1933 from tuberculosis devastated him and finally pushed him over the edge into the fringes of society. The stage was set for his entry into London's criminal underworld. Eddie Chapman arrived in London in early 1934. The vibrant, seductive nightlife of Soho beckoned, and Eddie quickly gravitated towards the district's shadowy criminal elements. Check theft, credit fraud, and housebreaking became the primary means by which he supported himself. Eddie's resume from these years reads like a patchwork of odd jobs and dubious dealings. A barman, masseur, film extra, boxer, wrestler, and even a dancer. Working as a barman allowed him to cultivate connections with Soho's criminal networks while maintaining a veneer of legitimate employment. In early 1936, Eddie married a woman named Vera Friedberg after knowing her for just 3 weeks. The marriage was largely one of convenience, intended to help Vera secure British citizenship. By the late 1930s, Eddie had established a notorious reputation as a safebreaker through his association with career criminal Jimmy Hunt, whom he met in jail in 1937. While Eddie would later be labeled as a master safecracker, in truth, his methods were far more crude. He and his criminal associates became known as the Jelly Gang, for their reliance on blowing up safes with gelignite to get at the cash inside. They targeted businesses such as cinemas, co-op stores, and dance halls, which they knew held sizable cash on premises. By the start of 1939, he had become one of Britain's most wanted men, with news of his crimes being splashed across national newspapers every other week. The law, once again, was bound to catch up with him. The Metropolitan Police were actively searching to identify him and the members of his gang, and Scotland Yard set up a dedicated investigating task force. The Jelly Gang decided they needed to hit targets further afield, away from the police hunting for them on the streets of London. Heading to Scotland, Eddie and his cronies managed to bungle a burglary of the St. Cuthbert's Co-op in Edinburgh later that year. The 4 burglars fled the scene with police in hot pursuit, and were eventually all rounded up and thrown into the Edinburgh prison. When Eddie appeared in court, he used a false name, Edward Arnold, and was granted bail. That proved a costly mistake, for Chapman fled as soon as he was released. And the Jelly Gang wasn't finished just yet. On the 4th of February 1939, they executed another daring robbery at a cooperative store in Bournemouth, making off with nearly £500. But Chapman knew his luck was running thin. Police bulletins featuring his photograph circulated nationwide, and his notoriety grew with each passing day. He knew that he needed to lie low, and so his eyes turned toward Jersey in the Channel Islands, a stepping stone that he thought could lead him south to Monte Carlo and eventually to South America. At the time, he was living with his girlfriend, Frida Stevenson, in Shepherd's Bush, but he chose to leave England with another woman, Betty Farmer, who was apparently blissfully unaware of his criminal life, and probably also of his other girlfriends. The couple checked into the luxurious Hotel de la Plage on Jersey's waterfront, and for the next week lived the high life, burning through the remainder of Chapman's ill-gotten gains. What Chapman didn't know was that his flight to Jersey was already known to the police, a letter written by his accomplice Darry to his girlfriend having been intercepted. One evening, while dining with Betty and two male companions at the hotel, Chapman noticed some men enter who he thought looked suspiciously like plainclothes policemen. He promptly fled into the night, leaving behind a bewildered Betty. It would be many years and many adventures later before the couple would reunite. Eddie Chapman was now well and truly in a pickle. He decided to break into the West Park Pavilion nightclub to steal funds to pay for his passage off the island. He spent the night in a seedy boarding house, but his notoriety had preceded him, with the landlady reporting to the police that the man she had heard of on the news that morning was staying in one of her rooms. The next morning, Eddie Chapman woke to find policemen at the foot of his bed, who promptly arrested him. This time, there would be no bail, and he soon pleaded guilty to larceny and housebreaking, receiving a 2-year prison sentence with hard labor. He could have counted himself lucky, as it was a far lesser sentence than he would have received had he been tried for his numerous crimes on the mainland. As the summer of 1939 faded into autumn, Eddie Chapman sat in a Jersey prison, watching through barred windows as the war in Europe intensified. He thought at first that he would simply serve his sentence and return to England, hopefully once the fighting was over. History, however, had other plans. On the 30th of June 1940, the unthinkable happened. German forces landed on Jersey, making it the only part of the British Isles to be occupied during World War II. Suddenly, Chapman was no longer just a British criminal, he was a British citizen in enemy hands. Always able to adapt and survive, Eddie Chapman used his imprisonment productively, learning French and befriending fellow prisoner Anthony Faramus. As the grim reality of the Nazi occupation set in, Eddie began formulating a cunning plan in the winter of 1941. Chapman wrote a letter to the German authorities offering his services as a saboteur and a spy. Chapman's primary motivations were twofold. Firstly, to gain his freedom from the cell in which he sat, and secondly, to take revenge against those who put him there, who he perceived to be the English ruling classes. When he received no response to his letter, Eddie Chapman took direct action, striding up directly to the German Kommandantur's office and requesting a meeting with von Stubnagel himself. When the sentry gave him a sideways look, Chapman boldly declared his purpose was geheim, secret. The German commander was initially suspicious of this unexpected volunteer asking to join the German Secret Service. Eddie, employing the same charm that had served him well in Soho's underworld, presented newspaper clippings documenting his criminal past. The timing proved fortuitous. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris of the Abwehr had been tasked with establishing a spy network in Britain in support of Operation Sea Lion, the Nazis' planned invasion of mainland Britain. In late 1941, Chapman was transferred to Fort Romainville, a prison camp outside Paris, that the Germans used to house high-value prisoners. There he was interrogated by German officers, including those of the dreaded SS. The Germans were impressed by the skills he acquired through his criminal activities, particularly his work with explosives. Deciding that they would make a saboteur out of him, Eddie found himself released from prison in the summer of 1942 and transported to an elegant villa in Nantes. The villa, under the command of Stefan von Gruning, served as an elite training center for German intelligence operatives. Here, Eddie Chapman entered a surreal world of espionage training under the personal tutelage of Dr. Ackermann, the meticulous German spy master. Eddie Chapman's days became an intensive crash course in espionage. Mornings were spent mastering explosives, including a particularly devious technique for sabotaging coal supplies, hollowing out lumps of coal, inserting explosives, and resealing them so perfectly that they detonated only when tossed into an enemy's factory or ship furnace. In the afternoons, he learned to send and receive Morse code swiftly enough to evade British direction-finding vans. He was also trained in how to use invisible ink and how to conceal messages in everyday items like clothing linings, book spines, and shoelaces. The final stage of his training was parachute jumping. His first jump left him with a sprained ankle, but by the fifth, he was confident and even began to relish the adrenaline rush. The Germans' confidence in Eddie grew as his training progressed, leading them to formulate plans for his first mission, which they grandly codenamed Operation Pastorius. From that point on, Eddie Chapman was to be known as Agent Fritz. Eddie received papers establishing his alias as Edward Arnold, along with a leather wallet containing £1,000 in crisp Bank of England notes, more money than he had ever possessed legitimately. The primary target of his sabotage operation was the de Havilland aircraft factory in Hatfield, a facility crucial to Britain's wartime production of the Mosquito bomber. Eddie was equipped with 2 wireless sets for communication, one disguised within an ordinary suitcase, and a backup miniature set hidden in a shaving kit. In December of 1942, the moment of truth arrived. Chapman was to parachute into Britain to begin his mission. At midnight, he was driven to an airfield where a Focke-Wulf reconnaissance plane waited with engines running. The insertion did not go smoothly. As the aircraft reached the drop zone over Cambridgeshire, Eddie was unceremoniously kicked out by the dispatcher and momentarily became stuck in the latch. When he finally broke free, Eddie found himself dropping through pitch-black sky, the white canopy of his parachute barely visible above him. The landing was catastrophic. He slammed into the frozen ground with such force that he seriously injured his vertebra. The pain was excruciating, but Eddie knew that discovery meant certain death as a wartime spy. Eddie gathered his equipment scattered across the field, the wireless set, his forged papers, and the explosive materials, and began moving painfully through the dark, unfamiliar terrain. Eddie stumbled for hours through hedgerows and fields, disoriented and becoming increasingly desperate. The silhouette of a farmhouse finally appeared through the gloom of early morning mist. As he approached, Eddie made a crucial decision, one that would alter not only the course of his life, but of the war itself. He decided to work for the British. An elderly farmer answered Eddie's knock, shotgun in hand, suspicious of the stranger appearing before dawn. Eddie claimed to be RAF Flight Lieutenant Edwards, whose plane had crashed nearby. He explained with convincing urgency that he needed to telephone his base. The farmer, still wary, allowed him to use the telephone. Instead of calling any RAF base, Eddie called the local police. The authorities who arrived saw straight through his thin RAF cover story. Eddie's equipment was decidedly not standard issue for British airmen. They were also skeptical of his then offer to work as a double agent. Within hours, he found himself in a blacked-out car heading to London's Latchmere House, which housed an interrogation centre codenamed Camp 020. There he was interrogated by Colonel Robin Stevens, known throughout British intelligence as Tin Eye, for his monocle and intimidating demeanour. Chapman deftly handled the barrage of questions hurled at him by the master interrogator. He told Colonel Stevens that he had always intended to approach British intelligence as a double agent from the very moment he became a German spy. MI5 officers conducted exhaustive background investigations, even tracking down and speaking to former associates from Eddie's criminal days in Soho. His offer to work as a double agent had sparked intense debate among British intelligence officers. His extensive criminal record and admitted life as a scoundrel and fraud hardly suggested reliability. Some MI5 officers argued that he should be interned for the duration of the war. But after conducting several lengthy interrogations interspersed with sessions where Eddie eagerly shared everything he had learned about German intelligence operations, MI5 reached a remarkable conclusion. Eddie Chapman was, by and large, telling the truth about his willingness to work against the Germans. Having passed initial muster, Chapman was transferred to Camp X, a training facility near Bewley in the New Forest. Chapman was a quick learner, his criminal background proving an asset rather than a liability. Years of living outside the law had given him the perfect temperament for espionage, cool under pressure, resourceful, and comfortable with deception. In January of 1943, MI5 officially designated Chapman as Agent Zigzag, a codename that perfectly captured his unpredictable trajectory between the German and British intelligence services. Zigzag was assigned to Section B1A, led by Lieutenant Colonel Tommy Attar Robertson, the man who was charged with running the double-cross system, which was the counterintelligence operation that controlled-turned German agents. This included many who were instrumental in Operation Fortitude, the Allies' grand scheme to deceive the Nazis as to the timing and location of the D-Day landings. The immediate challenge was how to deal with Eddie's sabotage mission given to him by the Germans. It was decided by MI5 that the best course of action was to fake an explosion and send disinformation back to the Germans. This deception operation was appropriately designated Operation Damp Squib. Victor Rothschild, head of MI5's anti-sabotage section and a member of the famous banking family, personally oversaw the planning. They needed to create a convincing explosion at de Havilland without actually damaging war production in order to convince the Germans that Chapman had in fact succeeded in his mission. This was easier said than done, but the solution proved ingenious. A small, controlled explosion would be staged at night when the factory was empty. Photographs would be taken of pre-existing damage at another facility, but presented as the results of Eddie's sabotage. A friendly journalist would be tipped off to ensure the incident made the newspapers, providing independent confirmation for Eddie's German handlers. Chapman himself was sent to Hendon, where he immersed himself in learning the minute details of his supposed attack, the exact location of the explosive placement, the sound and force of the detonation, even the smell that would linger afterward. It wasn't all hard work for Eddie Chapman, though. Always escorted by his MI5 shadows, he spent much time buying new clothes at London's best shops and visiting pubs. MI5 soon learned that Eddie was a man of expensive tastes. In one safe house, he requested and was given a gramophone with jazz records. He drank champagne when available and smoked cigars rather than cigarettes, telling his handlers that if he was to serve king and country, he should be treated like a king himself. As the date approached for Eddie Chapman's return to his German handlers, MI5 carefully prepared him for the dangerous deception ahead. They provided him with selected military information, genuine but outdated or already known to the Germans, to establish his credibility. They rehearsed his cover story repeatedly, testing him with the same aggressive questioning techniques that his German handlers would likely employ. As Agent Zigzag departed for Europe, MI5 knew that they were taking an enormous gamble on Chapman. He was no ordinary agent, and he was playing the highest stakes imaginable. MI5 arranged for him to return to his German contacts via Lisbon, traveling aboard the SS City of Lancaster, departing from Liverpool. He made contact with his German handlers via the German legation. He handed over his carefully prepared intelligence written in secret ink and told of the success of his mission to blow up the factory in de Havilland. Chapman was soon sent back to Paris, where he faced an intense interrogation by the Abwehr, including his primary handler Stefan von Gruning. Chapman was in his element, and based on his convincing reports of the de Havilland factory sabotage, Chapman's status was immediately elevated to that of Germany's most successful spy. For this, he was awarded the Iron Cross, making him the only British national known to have received this prestigious German military decoration for spying on behalf of the Third Reich. It was clear that the Nazis trusted their agent implicitly. He had them hook, line, and sinker. By this point, Eddie Chapman was deserving of a much-needed holiday, and so the Germans dispatched him to Norway. The holiday aspect tied in nicely with him being able to meet up with one of his handlers and to receive further training and briefing for his next mission. Not long after his arrival in the summer of 1943, he met a woman named Dagmar Lalem in the Oslo Ritz. They spent their days together sailing, swimming, and making love, a surreal interlude of normalcy amid the chaos of war. But it wasn't all play for Agent Zigzag. It turned out that Dagmar was working for the Norwegian resistance. They teamed up to gather intelligence for the British. Chapman was a keen photographer and liked to photograph his new girlfriend. That she would pose mostly outside military installations and fortifications while Eddie snapped away was surely just a coincidence. All good things must, however, come to an end, and Chapman soon had to say a sad farewell to Dagmar. After 11 months of clandestine R&R, it was time for Agent Zigzag to head back into the fray. In early 1944, Chapman was preparing to parachute back into England for his second spy mission. His task was to investigate why German U-boats were being lost in unprecedented numbers. The Kriegsmarine suspected the British had developed a new airborne radar system capable of detecting submarines on the surface at night or in poor weather, an alarming prospect that threatened the viability of Germany's Atlantic campaign. Chapman was tasked with gathering intelligence on these radar technologies and British anti-submarine tactics. He had attempted to make the trip across the Channel from Norway twice, but both times his departure had been cancelled. In the intervening period, the tide of the Second World War was turning decisively against Germany. The pivotal Allied invasion of Normandy, or D-Day, started on the 6th of June 1944. This event fundamentally altered the strategic landscape, including Eddie Chapman's second and final mission for Nazi Germany. A few days after D-Day, the Nazis began launching their pilotless, jet-powered flying bombs, the V-1s, towards London. The buzz bombs, or doodlebugs, as they were called by the British, were Hitler's secret weapon trump card, rarely his final gambit at staving off defeat. Chapman's mission was redirected towards informing the Germans of the effectiveness of their new long-range weapons and whether they were hitting their targets in London. Eddie was given the best equipment available for his mission: 2 cameras, a new wireless radio, a collection of poisons, a revolver, and £6,000 in cash. In the early hours of the 27th of June 1944, a lone Junkers aircraft flew over 6 Mile Bottom in the Cambridge Fens. The bomber was flying alone, and Chapman feared that the plane might be shot down by his own countrymen before reaching England. As he parachuted down, it was windy and slightly misty. The landing was again difficult. He landed hard on a country road between Cambridge and Newmarket, briefly knocking himself unconscious. After recovering, he cut loose his parachute pack and immediately sought out the British authorities. The local police got in touch with MI5, who were, thanks to ultra intercepts, prepared for Chapman's return. After meeting with the police, he was soon driven down to London in a small Austin 7. Within 5 hours, Eddie Chapman was having lunch with MI5 officers at the Naval and Military Club, led by his old friend Colonel Tommy Robertson. But the backslapping reunion was soon over. Not everyone at MI5 was happy to see Agent Zigzag again. His new handler, Michael Ryde, regarded Chapman as an encumbrance and an embarrassment, and made it his personal goal to expel Chapman from the British Secret Service at the first opportunity. MI5 had in fact already decided that this mission would be Eddie's last. He was too much of a loose cannon, and the worry was that he might cause more trouble than he was worth. Nevertheless, Chapman's mission for Germany presented MI5 with a significant opportunity for strategic deception that they could not resist. Knowing the Germans lacked accurate ground reports, the British planned to use Chapman to send disinformation. The plan was to exaggerate the impact of V1s in areas north and west of London, while minimizing reports from the south and east. The strategic goal was to deceive the Germans into shortening the V1's range, diverting attacks away from heavily populated areas towards less critical targets. In his radio transmissions, Chapman consistently indicated that the bombs were overshooting their targets, landing in north and northeast London rather than in the city centre. As a consequence, the Germans shortened their range, resulting in many bombs dropping harmlessly in farmlands short of the city and undoubtedly saving many thousands of civilian lives. On Saturday, the 1st of September, the last V1 launch sites in northern France were overrun, marking the end of the Doodlebug attacks. Approximately 5,500 people had been killed and 16,000 seriously injured in the 12 weeks since the attacks began. But the double agents' efforts made them less devastating. By the time that Paris was liberated in August of 1944, Eddie Chapman's indiscretions as an agent and lack of security were becoming a cause for increasing concern by MI5. He could not stop talking about his successes, which had gone to his head. The end for Agent Zigzag was inevitable. In early November 1944, and as the Allies advanced towards Berlin and the need for his services lessened, Eddie Chapman was dropped by the Double Cross Committee. MI5 formally terminated his employment as Agent Zigzag, and he was given a £6,000 payment, which is equivalent to approximately £260,000 today. He was also pardoned for his pre-war crimes. He was told in no uncertain terms that his wartime activities were subject to the British Official Secrets Act. The war's final months passed with Chapman in a strange limbo. Though no longer actively employed by MI5, he remained under surveillance. His movements and contacts were monitored by British intelligence, who were concerned about potential security breaches. When victory in Europe was declared in May of 1945, Chapman celebrated along with millions of his countrymen. But while others could share their war stories, Chapman's remarkable contributions remained classified under the Official Secrets Act. The criminal-turned-spy had served his country with extraordinary courage and cunning, yet could tell no one about it. After the war, Eddie Chapman reunited with Betty Farmer, the woman he had been forced to abandon after his arrest in Jersey. Their relationship endured despite the intervening years and Eddie's numerous other romantic entanglements. On the 9th of October 1947, they married quietly at Chelsea Register Office. Chapman published his first account of his life, The Eddie Chapman Story, in 1954. This covered parts of the time he spent in Germany, but necessarily omitted any mention of his work for MI5. This selective telling resulted in newspapers labeling him a traitor, accusations Eddie could not publicly refute due to the restrictions of the Official Secrets Act. Eddie's post-war life was characterized by material excess and varied business ventures. He owned a succession of yachts, drove a Rolls-Royce, and even purchased a steamer at one point. Together with Betty, he opened and operated several nightclubs and even a health spa. The line between Chapman's legitimate business and criminality remained blurry. He was linked to smuggling operations in Tangier, and in the early 1960s became embroiled in a bizarre plot involving the pretend kidnapping of businessman Shiv Kapoor. In 1966, Eddie finally received permission to publish The Real Eddie Chapman Story, which revealed aspects of his double agent career. The public response was immediate and enthusiastic. Chapman became a celebrity overnight, appearing on television and radio to discuss his exploits as Agent Zigzag. The book was subsequently adapted into a film titled Triple Cross, but the man could not help himself but fall back into criminality, being implicated in a Nigerian currency fraud scheme in the 1970s. As Eddie aged, his legitimate business ventures crumbled and his health deteriorated markedly. The back pain that had plagued him since the war worsened progressively, and a major stroke in the 1980s confined him to a wheelchair. His final years were spent in a private nursing home near St. Albans, and despite being largely bedridden, he continued to entertain visitors with his stories and irrepressible charm. On the 11th of December 1977, Eddie Chapman died of heart failure at the age of 83. He was survived by his wife Betty and daughters Diane and Suzanne. Eddie Chapman's death passed without significant public notice. The obituaries that did appear were generally complimentary, describing him as a brave man who had served his country despite his unconventional methods and background. The full extent of Eddie's wartime exploits remained classified until 2001, when his MI5 files were finally released to the UK National Archives. These documents, comprising over 1,700 pages, revealed previously secret details of his life as a double agent. While Eddie Chapman had received the Iron Cross from Nazi Germany, he received no official recognition from the country he ultimately served, Great Britain. Eddie Chapman, the safecracker, lover, spy, traitor, rogue, and hero, defied easy categorization in life and continues to do so in death. His is a story not of pure heroism, but of human complexity, of how the very qualities that make someone an outlaw in peacetime can make them invaluable in war. Yet for all his moral ambiguity, one fact remains undisputed. When his country needed him most, Eddie Chapman answered the call. The safecracker became a spy, the criminal became an agent, and Agent Zigzag earned his place in the hidden history of Britain's finest hour.